Welcome to our monthly Cannabis Lab educational programming. We have a dais of day one CLAB members here. It is an honor to be joined by my friends and my colleagues, Paula Savchenko, Dan Sparks, Zachary Kobrin. Thank you all for joining me today.
You're welcome.
So tonight we're going to be talking about what rescheduling. There's going to be some humor involved in this. Tonight, we're going to be talking about what rescheduling cannabis would actually look like, right? You know, when the news came out, the first thing I saw is I went to LinkedIn and it was just unanimously being supported amongst everybody there. And then a couple days later, the contradictory people came around because they needed clicks. And now, you know, it's kind of, I don't want to say it's fizzled, but it's, you know, Safer's coming to the front now. So let's talk about what that actually looks like. And I think we should start by talking about the scheduling system, right? Right now, cannabis is considered Schedule 1. You know, can someone tell us about like what schedules are we looking at and what would happen if it got moved down to 2 and 3? Paula, Dan, Zach.
Sure. I can take this one. Hi guys, I'm Paula Savchenko. So basically we're talking about the descheduling or rescheduling of cannabis. So obviously descheduling would mean that we're going from a class 1 substance to a 2 through 5. There's 5 classes, correct? Yeah, 2 through 5. So that would be rescheduling. Descheduling would mean that it would no longer be under any class of substance. So 280E, which is a big deal that I know we'll get into later, that includes the tax implications for the cannabis industry, is only applies to class 1 and 2. So if we do have a descheduling event below that, then 280E no longer will apply. We have like cocaine, which has no medical uses in Schedule 1. And then we have drugs like Tylenol in Schedule 3. So we are looking at somewhere between there.
So for those of us that just read the headlines, you know, I look at the psychedelic industry and you're seeing clinical trials, you see, you know, capital flowing into the industry, and you think, okay, well, I know where cannabis is in Schedule 1. You know, can you guys just talk about, for those who are just looking on the business side of the industry, why are psychedelic companies able to have a little bit more freedom than cannabis companies? Are they all considered Schedule 1? Are they on different schedules?
So as it relates to cannabis in Schedule 1 in particular, the major implication as it relates to your question and as it relates to the potential changes resulting from rescheduling. Number one, this recommendation by HHS is the first time that the federal government is acknowledging that there is medical value in cannabis. Yeah. And that in and of itself is a really big deal. It's something that 40 states and 40 state attorney generals and agencies within those states have already recognized. Citizens within all of those states have voted to approve. And these programs have been in existence in some states for decades. So that's a major implication as it relates to cannabis. To answer your question, psychedelics is a broad term and encompasses several different substances, some of which fall within Schedule 1, some of which are under different levels of scheduling within the CSA. And because of that, a lot of the research associated with derivatives and different compounds that mimic scheduled drugs, such as LSD, MDMA, psilocybin, those derivatives are either yet to be scheduled or are low enough in the CSA that allows for research, number one, and going through the FDA process for drug approvals.
I think if you're doing and this is kind of sideways off topic, but if you're doing the comparison on psychedelics industry versus cannabis, you can look at the fact that in the United States, we basically skipped research and development, went straight to commercialization, right? The psychedelics industry has identified specific components, specific plant-based materials, and targeted them for specific ailments and specific conditions. That's a true typical pharmaceutical process, right? That's why we've seen, you know, FDA research, FDA approved research studies, stage 3 for the various, items. It's not just, oh, psychedelics are legal. It's, that X product has been authorized by the FDA for use in clinical trials for Y condition. Cannabis, on the other hand, has never done that, right? The cannabis industry developed and went straight to commercialization, skipped the research and development aspect. So unlike the pharmaceutical industry, it's not like 25 years ago, folks in the cannabis industry and said, we're going to identify this specific cannabinoid and this specific protein component within the cannabinoid and determine whether or not it is best suited to treat Y condition. Now, I'm sure there are people that have done that, and there are people that do that. So everyone out there, please don't jump hating on me that it's been done before. All I'm saying is, in the traditional sense, that's why you're seeing the difference. Correct. Cannabis industry started nowhere near the way that the psychedelic, quote unquote,
The modern
started. Yeah.
cannabis and psychedelic industry for sure. It's interesting on that note because it did just go directly to recreational or adult use or whatever you want to call it. But wouldn't that be? And by the way, feel free to, if you want to jump in and answer his, we can make this a discussion. We've all known each other long enough. But, looking at cannabis, is it because because it was Schedule 1? So you really can't do any sort of clinical testing. You had the University of Mississippi was the only people who could do it.
Yeah. So the Schedule 1 is what, we're now going back and giving a history lesson, but so Schedule 1 under the Controlled Substances Act effectively says that there is no known or recognized medical use, and there is a high likelihood of abuse, right? The farther you go down the scheduling system, that scale changes. So for example, Schedule 3 says there is I think it's moderate or interim likelihood for abuse and a known recognized medical use for the drug. So that's how it works amongst, I think it's 5 different other factors, but 5 total factors, but there's a number of factors. There's an interesting concept to look at and when people, just to kind of give the broader understanding, HHS's mandate was specifically to look at the medical efficacy of it. So they looked at the medical issues, they looked at the likelihood of abuse aspects. DEA is actually the authority that would regulate this type of drug, and it does regulate the use and enforcement of this type of drug. DEA has the final authority on whether or not to reschedule marijuana, which is what we're dealing with here. DEA's mandate and their analysis will go beyond what HHS did. Whereas HHS was limited to, this is a lane that we live in. DEA's lane is much wider. They don't just look at the medical efficacy aspect or the abuse aspect that HHS looked at. They look at a number of factors. One of the things that's really interesting is some people are saying is that DEA may be bound by HHS's findings, in that DEA may not be able to come out and say there are no known medical accepted uses, because there's discussion within the industry and within professionals and wonks like us to say, hey, they have to be bound up from the medical aspect and medical analysis that HHS did. If that's the case, what ends up happening is DEA has to then sit back and say, in our global analysis of, it's under the Administrative Procedures Act, it's like an 8-factor test that every agency does. Now we're getting really, really wonky and we're probably losing viewers. But when they do that, they would have to then find other reasons to not reschedule it.
Okay. So if we get down to Schedule 3, what changes are we going to start seeing? I know, obviously, Paula, you said, we wouldn't have to deal with 280E anymore, but does this basically make cannabis just strictly a pharmaceutical?
Yes and no.
So I just want to add to what you were saying with HHS and DEA. Like, the reason that HHS made the recommendation to begin with was because Biden asked them to look into it last year. So that's like how we kind of got to where we are now. And then I think it's important for you to add on, like what we were talking about, how the DEA what you told me before, how DEA has historically.
That's where she wants you to jump in.
Yeah, you go for it.
Thank you. So, correct me if I'm wrong, anybody.
You're wrong.
Thank
You're
you.
allowed to be
Thank you.
wrong. We can treat it like it's the podcast.
So my understanding is that HHS previously recommended to the DEA to schedule Kratom under Schedule 1, and due to lobbying efforts and citizen commentary and letters and all the above, DEA ultimately did not schedule Kratom, and that was as of recently.
I think that's like the only known example where they deviated from what HHS said.
And they did deviate. However, it was the inverse. They didn't receive a recommendation to take a scheduled substance and lower the scheduling. They requested the inverse. They recommended to actually take this herbal supplement. Lots of similarities you can draw between Kratom and cannabis, and said, this is a dangerous drug. It should be Schedule 1. And the DEA did not, in fact, follow that recommendation. So that in of itself, in my opinion, is significant in that they didn't follow their recommendation to do something that arguably had to schedule a herbal supplement that arguably has considerable medical value.
Yeah, I think something else to talk about if we're talking about whether or not DEA could potentially deviate. And honestly, if you put 10 professionals, 10 lawyers in a room, 10 people that deal with this, and ask them, you're going to get 10 different answers. No question about it.
And you're going to pay a lot of money for them.
Right. But call me. So one of the things I think that a lot of people universally think that if there is a basis to give the DEA cover to not move it to Schedule 3 is something that's called the UN Single Convention on Narcotics. And what that basically is it's effectively a treaty amongst a number of nations through the United Nations on how to treat the scheduling and regulation of certain narcotics. Without going too far down the rabbit hole of how the regulations work, effectively, it says, notwithstanding whatever your regulatory policy is in your country, you're going to treat it the same as it is in the convention, in this treaty. And as long as marijuana is treated as a Schedule 1 under the single convention, under the Narcotics Convention with the UN, DEA could use that as cover to say, we can't deviate from that because it's a treaty. Now, there are actually a number of ways around it. The DEA has its own, if they wanted to, they could deviate on there. There is procedures in place for them to do that. But they could take the simple high road and say no. One of the things that I think gets lost in the debate, and yes, this is all important, is the reality is that there are two agencies that make a boatload of money from marijuana being a Schedule 1 narcotic. IRS and the DEA. It's as simple as that, right? You've got cannabis companies that have effective tax rates of 80, 90% that are paying, upwards of tens of hundreds of millions of dollars of taxes because they can't take deductions.
They have tax bills of hundreds of millions of dollars.
Right.
Not all of them are paying it.
Exactly.
Well, yes. Okay. So, but plus you've also got, I read a report a couple years ago that said something like the majority of cash seizures from the DEA comes from marijuana seizures. Like, there isn't as much as, and you have a president that, despite the mandate, like Paula talked about, to analyze it, the president didn't come out and say reschedule it or deschedule it. The president said, I want them to look at it. He is on the record as not being the biggest proponent for marijuana and cannabis. So, like, I'm not trying to play Debbie Downer on this one, but just being a little devil's advocate, I've talked to a lot of my friends in the industry, and a lot of people truly believe Schedule 3 is going to move to Schedule 3. They don't have a basis to deny it. I think the politics, I think in the money, I don't think the White House is lending as much weight as they could to this. Could very easily give cover to the DEA to say, we're going to keep it at Schedule 1 or maybe move it to Schedule 2, which would not open up that much more benefit.
One thing to think about as it relates to the UN Single Convention is Canada, right? Canada legalized federally and is part of exporting cannabis to Germany, different countries, different continents. So I guess hopefully that's part of a counter argument if the DEA does claim that we're subject to the UN Single Convention.
I want to go back to Todd's original question that I kind of like rolled us around in, which was what would be the benefits of us having a rescheduling event to Schedule 3? So if we do get there, some of the benefits would be that we would then have potentially, we would have an easier route with banking as well as investment. Pretty much everybody in the industry knows right now it's really difficult to raise money. So, a lot of people are pushing for it that way. Then you would be able to not automatically, but sooner list on the stock exchange.
I think that's the single biggest issue right now. The minute that opens up, the market explodes.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Right now, for those that don't know, you can't, sorry to interrupt, you
You're
can't,
good.
if you're a plant touching company in the United States, you can't be listed on a major exchange in the US. So NASDAQ and New York Stock Exchange, which is why most of the cannabis companies in the US go to, have Canadian parent
Well,
companies.
theoretically, even in Canada, everybody's on the OTC with the exception of TerraSyn.
Right. But so everyone's on the CSE. OTC,
sorry.
OTC would be the over the counter exchange, which
Sorry, I'm just
Anyway.
thinking about how I tried to invest in it personally. It's
um,
not investment advice.
but I do think that that's the single biggest, once the exchanges open up, the true blue chip American companies that list there, think like every pharmaceutical company, Big Tobacco, Unilever, Procter and Gamble, Coca-Cola, like True, Johnson & Johnson. I mean, those companies. I mean, look, the reality is, and this is getting into the larger macro sense, the reality is the largest cannabis company in the world is still smaller than some of the smallest pharmaceutical companies in the world, right? So the ability to use their revenue stream and their existing manufacturing and distribution hubs, whether or not you're in pharmaceutical, whether or not you're in tobacco, whether or not you are in, CPG, consumer product goods industries, that's a huge influx. And those companies can get in for relatively cheap, especially now in an economy like this, and immediately start injecting income. I do think if we move to Schedule 3, the likelihood of safe banking passes 100%, and I do think the exchanges will open up.
So on that note, let's talk about kind of the major point of this discussion is Schedule 3 better for the industry, or is it to stay Schedule 1 for the immediate future and just try to get something like safer banking passed, right? Because as you just explained, if we go to Schedule 3, it seems that, a lot of these companies, they have the scars on their back, they got a ton of debt, and it's the light at the end of the tunnel, and Big Pharma is going to come in and scoop up most of the big MSOs, which are going to be even harder to compete with. Now, I don't doubt at some point in time, you will have your brands that will be able to come out of the ether and get big, the Liquid Deaths of the world, if you will, in the cannabis space. But for the most part, you're going to be competing with pharmaceuticals. And then will there be a lobby to keep it just medical and kill the recreational side of things, or adult use, or whatever you want to call it, right? Because now they have their money behind it. Why would they want to compete with the guys in Sacramento that are selling it to anybody who can walk in off the street, right? So when I say that, I mean the legal dispensaries there. So would it be better for the near term for the industry as a whole, and not even as a whole, because I think there are two sides to this. There are the people that are public and have a ton of investors, and there are the people that are coming up and that are smaller. Where do we see benefits both ways in either keeping it at Schedule 1 and keeping things the way they are and dealing with the ridiculously high taxes and barriers to entry and everything else, or going to Schedule 3, getting an influx of capital, being able to list, but also potentially losing the industry as it is today?
So there's a lot of talk about the fact that Schedule 3 is not enough, and that in the event that Schedule 3, that cannabis is rescheduled to Schedule 3, that the momentum will be lost, and that the desire from Congress at all to do anything further past Schedule 3 will be an afterthought and won't be a focus.
It's like one of those house projects where you run out of paint and you're like, that's enough done, I'll fix it next weekend, and you just never get back to it.
That's actually a really good analogy.
Yeah.
In the sense that You'll finish your thought.
No, I was just going to say that I disagree. Personally, I
Okay.
disagree. I think that progress is progress
Yeah.
and that it's positive. And the fact that safer banking, a new iteration of SAFE is now going to be heard in the Senate next week. I don't think that that's coincidental to the fact that a federal body came out and said, no, actually there is medical value
Yeah.
to this substance. So I think that there is momentum. I think that there's potential for major progress. And personally, I think that moving to Schedule 3 would be a positive step in the right direction that would not be an end to the means, so to speak.
I know like 4 people on LinkedIn that are really angry right now.
So I agree 100%. It's a positive for the things that you, like we talked about.
Financially.
Financially, it's a massive benefit. But the reality is it's still illegal to sell marijuana, right? It's still a controlled substance. Most people, I think most people, unless you're the USDA and we're talking total THC and then THCA, and then we'll go down that rabbit hole another day. The point being, look, if we're talking about rescheduling, one of the things that people are concerned about is when you dispense a Schedule 3 controlled substance, you have to be an authorized by the DEA to dispense it, like a pharmacy or doctor's office, right? We've not seen that yet. No cannabis company. So, like, if we're talking about what are the downsides of it, it's still an illegal substance.
Would insurance come into play at that point?
So I think insurance is 100% going to be, more available. But the point I guess I'm getting at, like to your analogy with the painting the house, is it does go far, but there are still a lot of things that you need to finish painting the house, right? So like one of the things I've been telling a lot of clients when they're talking to me and asking me about it is, hey, listen, right? Like Schedule 3 would be great, but if it's not accompanied with congressional reforms or agency reforms, we may have an issue, right? DEA, FDA have to get together and actually do something. Congress probably has to do something to keep the existing state model in place and not, create a real issue for these other companies that have dispensaries all over the country and wouldn't have DEA licensing.
Paul, I know you've done a ton of work getting people licensed and dealing with the regulatory framework and everything else. What do you think? Do you think it'll be your job gets easier at Schedule 3 or?
I think that my job gets easier in that these companies free up money that would be going to taxes or other barriers that they have right now that they can then use for expansion. And then they can use to build their roster and look better, right? Because we know that these applications are competitive in most states. So I would say, like, from that side, it's interesting you're bringing up applications because back to the 280E side, in Alabama, they recently released, it's been a mess, but they recently released their licenses a couple of months ago, and they issued 5 licenses for vertical, and then took them back, like literally a week later. And then they issued them again, and they released different results the second time around. And Verano was one of the companies that did receive it the first time around and didn't receive it the second time around. I don't know how accurate this is, but there's been a lot of conversation about that the reason Verano didn't get it the second time around was because their financials, when they were rescored, didn't do as well. And the reason they didn't do as well is because they have a really large tax liability that hasn't been paid. And so, that kind of goes into like, why is that the state's concern if they're paying their taxes or not? And I'm sure that they're working towards that. And then it's like what we were talking about before. Now, let's say we do have a descheduling or rescheduling event. What's going to happen with all of these companies that have tax liabilities and aren't paying them? So I mean, that I know you wanted to talk about. Go for it.
What we were talking about is the fact that a number of major operators in the space, and what we were saying earlier as well, have major tax liabilities right now to the tune of $500 million. And if the capital markets are not friendly or cost effective to borrow money, which they aren't
are
at the
not.
moment, and the tax penalty is considerably less than whatever interest rate you'd be paying. I'm not advocating for the strategy, but I see it, I
Definitely a
recognize it.
strategy.
Yeah, and so the one
happening?
question is, if
What he's
It's
basically saying
rescheduled.
is using the not payment of your taxes under 280E as effectively a way to raise money.
Yeah.
and
As your
use the
bank.
capital, and then another question then becomes, if 280E no longer applies to cannabis, is that retroactive?
That's a massive question that I don't think it does, but I'm not a tax lawyer. And that's a huge issue because that
$500 million.
But then how are they going to apply taxpayer dollars to audit you 3 years back or however many years they say they can go if they say fraud?
But
But I'm saying like they're not, it's going to be difficult for them to justify using taxpayer dollars to then go back and audit people.
I mean,
It's going to be the harder question. It's not the new audits. It's the question is the people that have the existing stuff going on is really the
they
difficult
can't justify how they lost an F-35 stealth fighter jet, and you think they're going to justify using they don't have to justify it to us, they just have to tell us.
Yeah.
But is there something on that note? Is there something that would automatically make it retroactive? Because
No.
I don't see them giving up.
Well, they
dollar
could, but
of
I don't
what
think
they're
they're
owed.
going to pass legislation that's
No, why would
they? Yeah.
They want their money. They want the
Yeah.
last of it, especially if they're not going to have it going forward. You know, I imagine that somebody on Capitol Hill somewhere has done some kind of analysis, says, hey, if we deschedule it, then they grow this much, we'll make this much money. But
if you're watching, we'd love to see your analysis.
also, if you need a loan, greencheck.com/marketplace. Yeah, I had to get that one in there. But like the descheduling to me seems like it just throws so many new problems in, because you do have, I mean, I'm going to keep calling it recreational cannabis in 23 states. So in 23 states, you can walk in off the street and give your license and buy cannabis, buy weed, whatever you want, and some great products, mind you. All of a sudden it becomes a pharmaceutical thing. These buildings are licensed to dispense weed, but they're not licensed by the DEA to give out
It's
medicine.
still illegal in an adult use state. So that doesn't change, right? So the question of, right, like, are people that are licensed in Maine, which is an adult use state, that own a recreational dispensary, gonna close their stores? No, they're not. The real question, take your thought process a step further. Is the DEA going to start enforcing? Is the DEA going to say it's a good use of our resources to start enforcing the Controlled Substances Act and raid dispensaries and try and shut down dispensaries that are operating without a DEA license? Do I think they will? Yes. Do I think that they're going to use a boatload of their resources to do this? Probably not. Which I come back to, like, there needs to be some kind of policy behind a schedule change, a rescheduling.
This, when you're talking about the DEA registration, it reminded me of when we first had the Farm Bill, and there were like, you know, those 2-3 years after that where there was just like so many inconsistencies, and there still is on a state by state basis. But some of the states were requiring the hemp testing labs to have DEA registration. And some states weren't, but the federal requirement was that they did have that registration. So then you saw like almost states that were causing people to be non-compliant with federal law because there were so many inconsistencies. And I think that's, you know, if we do see a deschedule or reschedule event, we'll see a couple years where there will be a lot of space for messing up until anybody's really cracking down on it, I think. And then from there, we will see some crackdowns, but I don't think we're getting closer to DEA using, you know, raiding. I think it will be other types of crackdowns that are non-compliance with the regulations. And then I want to talk about some
Didn't yours
other.
see FDA come in and
I was
under the-
just going to talk about FDA. I think one of the potential downfalls, and it's like unfortunate to say it's a downfall, but I think it will be, is the FDA coming in and having additional regulatory enforcement, because we've seen how they've regulated hemp. We've seen how that's gone, and then we're getting more into that area.
You
So
think packaging rules suck in certain
Yeah.
states? Wait till you guys
Yeah.
deal with the actual Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act.
mhm,
So since you brought it up,
mhm,
we have instances of how the FDA has attempted to regulate, call it bad actors within the hemp industry, and they didn't come in guns blazing. They sent letters. They said, you can't make medical claims. Your packaging needs to change. You need to do these things or else.
I don't know that the FDA can actually come in guns blazing,
That's my point.
but I do think that they are going to be more.
That's the point.
No, but I think they're going.
You got roaches in your kitchen. Put them up.
I think that they're going to do more than what they've been doing in the hemp industry. Yeah.
Well, how much longer are we going to have two separate industries where it's hemp and cannabis? I mean, you have hemp being under fire right now and people trying to make it federally illegal, and at least some of the other alternative cannabinoids that are out there. So like, when do they start getting considered to be part of the same family?
Dan really wants to answer this.
I see that.
I want you to opine, sir, on the federal case in Alabama, where the state of Alabama attempted to say that Delta 8 is not permitted. Arkansas, same thing. It's not the same thing. I'm sorry. Arkansas,
Alabama's a lot better at football.
federal judge in Arkansas said the state of Arkansas is not allowed to pass a law that says Delta 8 is not permitted.
Okay.
Wind them up and let them go.
Send me back my engagement letter and the retainer, and I'll gladly give you an opinion. No, really. So what it was it's an injunction. There's a law in Arkansas that regulated, severely restricted the sale of Delta 8 and potentially other cannabinoids from hemp. So you could take it a step further, Delta 8, THCA, THCB, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there was a lawsuit filed challenging it. The federal court in Arkansas basically issued an injunction which stopped the implementation of the law, saying that the state couldn't do that under certain aspects of the federal law. I'm not going to go down the whole rabbit hole of no. That's okay. I'm not going to do that.
We got to take questions at some point.
All right.
The whole point being that case, which is completely off topic for this. Yeah, completely. Potentially, if that's extrapolated out to other courts in other states, it could open up as federal precedent, or it is federal precedent potentially, that any other states trying to strike down the sale or production or manufacture of Delta 8 or other hemp-derived cannabinoids are illegal under federal law.
My point that I was trying to make was that
What's your opinion?
hemp is not scheduled. It's a federally legal substance, and the only distinguishing measure between what is hemp and what is cannabis, medical marijuana, etc., is Delta 9 THC concentration, right?
So that opens up a whole look. We'll give the background. It's all cannabis. It's one plant, two cousins under the same plant, hemp, marijuana. The federal government came up with this cockamamie distinction of, okay, here's the line that you draw, and when it's a hemp plant and when it's a marijuana plant. Now, I'm not an agronomist. I'm not a plant scientist. I couldn't even begin to tell you what the actual chemistry of the plant is that makes one thing a hemp plant and one thing a marijuana plant. All I know is the federal government said Delta 9 THC above 0.3%, you're marijuana. Now, it gets even more confusing if you go to USDA, which came up with this other rule called the total THC rule, not the Delta 9 rule, which is, again, not relevant. Right, not relevant to this. But to your point, it's all cannabis. At what point are we not going to be dealing with two separate industries? I don't know. I'm not that smart. If I was,
He's lying
A
about
long
not being smart.
time. I think a long
Or
time,
involved.
Yeah.
It's just
I think-
interesting. Do you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, you're good. I also think
Should
we
be
should,
sorry.
I want to talk about what this will do to the black market.
Well, I feel
Um,
like the black market's going to explode.
Really? You think that if there's a descheduling, there will be more?
Yeah, I do. And this
Okay.
is why. So if we look at California right now, how many licensees did not renew their legal cannabis license?
Mhm.
They've been growing weed for 30, 40, 50 years, generations of family. It wasn't like they lost their license and they said, we're going to grow tomatoes now. You know, they're going right back to what they were doing before. I think all the people who have fought and clawed, if their business gets taken away from them or they are not able to operate, and that's what they do and that's what they've done, they're going right back to what they've done and what they will always do. And it will strengthen the black market, especially if it goes to big pharmaceutical companies, because there's just such a culture around this plant that no quote unquote medication has, right? I mean, the culture around Oxy is up in
Yeah.
Delray Beach and a bunch of rehab facilities. But my point being is, you know, this has been a culture. It's been something that's been a part of culture for thousands
Seems
upon
to know
thousands of
from
years.
experience.
My wife was an addiction counselor.
I think I see that point, and I didn't think about it that way, but I think that's a good point. When I've been thinking through what will this do to the black market, I think this will help the black market.
If
Or
they-
it will help have less black market
If they
because
lower the barrier of entry for people to get in, I think.
because the biggest reason, at least from my conversations, why people want to stay on the black market side or have both a legal and a black market to their business is because they want to get around 280E, and there's just no way around it unless
Yeah.
you're going to be doing that. And so then you kind of do away with that. But then the question to that is, where does the government make that money back then? Do they create another tax, or what are they going to do?
So moderator will jump into this discussion here, but no, I see your point, and definitely, you know, a lot of people, the black market is an easy way to skirt around taxes. Obviously, it's what
Legacy
they've done
market.
before, legacy, whatever you want to call it, the original market, have you, right? But we all know what we're talking about here. The thing is, if you do not have the option to operate your business, you're not going to give up growing weed. You're going to continue to grow or sell weed because it's what you've known. You just had a little bit of a period where you didn't have to look over your shoulder. If the big pharmaceutical companies come in and I'm buying my weed from GSK or AstraZeneca, right? Like, that black market, I believe, is going to explode because they're not gonna hire felons. They're not gonna hire people who've been arrested for weed. They're not gonna hire the traditional cultivators, and they're not gonna want to work with them either.
Take that thought process a step further, though. If you're these traditional multi-billion-dollar public companies, big pharma, big tobacco,
Mhm.
whatever, that's now legally growing or manufacturing or selling marijuana, right? And you've got money to put behind federal policy. I mean, the only reason that the legacy market thrives is because states and the federal government don't want to expend resources to shut them down. Yeah. If you're Glaxo, if you're GSK or Merck or Philip Morris and you've got billions in revenue, aren't you going to spend millions lobbying and pushing the federal government to now start enforcing, going after these legacy operators?
I
Yeah,
think
but-
also
This is a good one.
Aren't those companies more concerned with selling something that is uniform and replicable and consistent, a la a tablet or maybe a tincture? I mean, we're not talking about, we can point to GW. GW grows tons of cannabis in the UK. You can't buy flour from
Jazz.
GW, Jazz now. You can't buy flour from them, right?
Yeah.
So Marinol, the makers of Marinol, Dronabinol, they're not also.
Oh, can you imagine if that's what they named strains?
That's my point, right? Is like, I think in an ideal world, they can coexist, meaning you can go into a Walgreens CVS and you can get your THCV pills or your CBN pills for sleep or whatever it is. And then at the same time, there are other outlets for craft herbal medicine, just like
Just like
you
the
have
beer.
other
Walking
herbal.
into CVS and getting a
Yeah.
30-day supply of Funky Buddha Purple Haze.
Maybe.
I mean, the original Florida market felt like that, right? I mean, it would be better if they would have had chips and stuff at the front counter for impulse
I
buys,
mean, if
but
you can buy Sprig,
But
you
it'll
know,
be
or whatever it is, like, is it really that much of a departure?
it'll be just like how like the craft beer industry is, and then how there's, you know, the larger beer companies and then the craft,
I mean, the
grows.
larger,
and they can coexist, and we've seen that in Illinois. Like there's these huge MSOs, and then there's the craft grows and the smaller
So,
groups, and,
I
and
think
they do
down
work
the line, though,
together.
that's the larger move. Like for me, at least, is not a pharmaceutical type industry, but an alcohol based industry. You know, put it under the TTB and regulate it like the alcohol industry. You know, then you can find that coexistence of
100%.
you know, not needing to walk into CVS and buy it, but you know, the balance of it's a nutraceutical.
You still have
can-
regulations,
right.
Yeah,
And the
And some-
brewery model, where
Right.
you can walk into a brewery that makes beer right there.
Dear
Or
Diary.
walk into a grow that is also, you know, has a tasting room,
Right.
so on and
That's
so
the
forth.
advantage of being in this industry.
What's
But
the next Napa for weed?
but Humboldt.
and some states are
That might
going
save Humboldt.
down.
Yeah.
Napa.
Oh, weed tourism. Sorry.
You're good. Some states are going down this path of having their liquor regulating agencies regulate. Like some states are looking at the dispensaries being regulated by those, or already are, and then the ag side being regulated by the other agencies.
I like that model the best because you can see the competition. Like, you know, Sierra Nevada was not the giant that it is at one point in time. And you have people that have been able to come out of nowhere and build brands and then get absorbed. I think the thing is when I think about big pharma or pharmaceutical companies coming into this space, I think we have like 5 more minutes, so we should probably take questions. I think of absorption and them, you know, buying a Curaleaf and it becoming GSK instead of letting it just continue to operate as Curaleaf or letting it operate as Trulieve, whatever it is. So do we see that happening where we just, it's still Trulieve, it's still Curaleaf, it's still Air, but we just know GSK owns it, or we know that Merck owns it or something like that, and it
Depends on the
operates.
company. Depends on the strategy, right?
Yeah.
Like there are definitely, you know, there are definitely big MSO operators that they buy someone, but they keep the brand that they originally bought. And then there are some that they fully integrate them in. It's you can company by company, it's gonna be different.
Like, I know it's a weird example, but it's just relevant now. You look at the way when Penn bought Barstool, they let Barstool be Barstool, right? So like, well, we see that in the cannabis space where these companies get to just continue to work the way they are, and then they will have a lot of money behind them to support the legacy growers.
I mean, that's a
and bring 'em in.
CPG play, right?
Yeah.
That's not a pharmaceutical move. That's a CPG play, right? You look at look at Johnson & Johnson, you look at Unilever, right? Unilever owns dozens of brands, right? But they're not marketed as Unilever chips or Unilever cleaning supplies. Right. I mean, it's, you know, so, or even like Coca-Cola is a perfect example. Coke owns Aquafina, but this doesn't say Coca-Cola water, it says Aquafina. So I think you know, it depends on the brand.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's in the brand as far as what's shown to consumers. I agree. But then as far as how the companies run, it's kind of what Zach was saying, it's going to depend on the company and what they want to do. Because when it's big pharma, it's just so much liability for them to let someone that's
Yeah.
not fully under their control or umbrella have that much control over the
No.
company. But then if it's some other industry, maybe tobacco, liquor, I don't, you know, some one of those industries, maybe it's not as much. It can be more.
I mean, you can also look at like private equity firms. Private equity firms go around and they buy up companies and industries. They don't, you know,
They don't
take
manage
over,
it.
you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
I
They're
mean,
just,
they have controlling interests and a certain level of management control, but they don't change the name. You know, UFC and WWE just merged, but there's still going to be a WWE and there's still going to be a UFC.
so with that, if we get descheduling or rescheduling to Schedule 3, you know, do we still want, or is everyone still cheering for safe to pass? And or is this just okay if we get to 3, safe's gonna pass, or is still a chance that that's gonna do what it does the last 9 times it went to vote?
Saves more window dressing than anything.
I know.
I think the banks are gonna have, if we have a descheduling event and don't have a banking bill passed, then I think that we'll have an issue, still have issues with banking. We need something to pass to give them, the kind of guidance that they need to know what to do. Otherwise, they're kind of gonna be like, what do we do with this?
Exactly. And if you're a bank looking to make cannabis companies, greencheck.com. And so easy to do the commercials here. So I think at the end of the day, we can come to the conclusion that
Can I get a royalty if I start advertising for them?
yes, probably.
Greencheck.com.
There you go. I'll get you a hat.
Greencheck.com.
Repetition.
Greencheck.com.
You need like a
Yeah. Put the logo up. So I think at the end of the day, what we can realize is all we can do at this point is speculate on what's going to happen. Nobody really knows. No one has a guess. There are things that will happen to ADE, et cetera, et cetera. But at the end of the day, the only thing that's going to happen is going to be 4 people at the table, just like us, giving their opinions.
I know exactly what's going to happen, but I saved that sage wisdom for my clients. So if you'd like to know what's going to happen, hit me up.
All right. Actually, we didn't do that at the beginning because I was rushing to get us started. But thank you guys for a great discussion. We will probably record this. Everyone watch it live. We're going to take questions, but in the meantime, I'm going to let them all plug their businesses. So Matt, if you can pull up the Q&A portal or just let everyone know we're going to be taking questions now. So
ahead,
Paula.
Hello, I'm Paula Savchenko. I'm the founder of Canacor Group. We are a full-service, multi-state cannabis licensing firm. So we work with groups in the cannabis industry and outside of the industry that are looking to get involved in new states. And we identify new opportunities, so track legislation and regulations as the states are moving through opening up new application periods, manage the application period for our clients, submit the applications, and then sometimes handle litigation after the fact if needed. So that's us.
How do they get in touch with you?
Canacorgroup.com.
Hey, everyone. Daniel Sparks, founder of Sparks Consulting. We're a full service cannabis consulting company. We offer services to licensees, applicants, and ancillary businesses that service the space. Real estate is a heavy focus of ours, as well as entitlements at the municipal level, licensing at the state level, and also brand licensing, among other things. You can reach us at our website, sparsconsulting.co. And yeah, great to have the opportunity to speak to you as a independent contractor finally.
And Sparks Uncensored.
Thank you.
It'll be uncensored.
Amazing.
My name is Zach Kobrin. I'm a partner at Ackerman, a large national law firm. We're the first large national law firm to have a dedicated cannabis practice. We have one of the largest cannabis practices across the country. I'm based in South Florida, but I work with clients, operators, ancillary businesses, financial institutions across the country. You can reach out to me anytime. Zachary, Zachary .Kobrin, Kobrin at Ackerman, AKERMAN.com.
All right. Matt, what are our questions?
Hi, Dr. Uma.
Why can't cannabis be treated as tobacco? And the deschedule is also like ibuprofen over the counter, 200 milligrams, and
A lot of people won't get their money.
So ibuprofen is actually scheduled. But I think your question is politics. It's politics and policy. I wish there was something more technical and tell me if you guys think differently, but it's the politics and the policy.
It is. We didn't even go down the tinfoil hat route
And
on
money.
any of this.
And
Same.
And money.
Same.
Oh, our producer has a question.
So just yell your question and we'll repeat it.
all right. So basically, it's more of a statement and a question. I think why this is such a complex topic is because cannabis is looked at in so many different ways. It's compared to alcohol, it's compared to pharmaceuticals, it's compared to, tobacco. You could even compare it to coffee in some ways. So like, I think that's why it's so tough. I just wanted to get your guys' thoughts on that because, was listening to like the whole back and forth, and so many different industries were compared.
There are all types of implications related to social justice, related to personal privacy, health, autonomy. Cannabis is a very broad issue that is not just as simple as whether or not it is a pharmaceutical or an herbal supplement or a medicine or something that adults utilize and use for enjoyment. It's all of those things, right? So I think that really contributes to the difficulty of how to regulate it, how to put in place safeguards, right? Because in some instances, people have, call it, adverse results with cannabis. However, I have yet to hear of one death related specifically to cannabis ingestion. Zach's going to chime in and tell me about the one time.
Nope.
No, it's the only alternative cannabinoids, the
So
traditional
there's no,
cannabis now.
There's no LD 100. There's no
Yeah.
amount of cannabis that you can consume.
The only one
will kill
time
you.
we know of is, I think it was incidental ingestion by an employee, but
I feel like the only way to die from ingesting cannabis is to choke on it.
let's not go down this conversation.
No.
But the difficulty is because it is unique. There are a lot of ways to analogize it to different things, but it's not alcohol. It's not traditional medicine, traditional pharmaceutical medicine. And there are a lot of financial implications for keeping it the way that it is.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. It gets to a larger conversation of, at one point, there really wasn't a regulation of alcohol. And then they came up with a way to regulate it. And at one point, there really wasn't a regulated way or way to regulate tobacco. And then they came up with a way to regulate the tobacco industry. Same with parimutuels or gambling, same with pharmaceuticals. And everyone in the cannabis industry, we all prognosticate and we all sit here and go, well, why don't we make it more like alcohol? Why don't we make it more like pharmaceutical or more like tobacco? Why don't we just treat it as this is a new industry? Let them create a way that works to regulate it. You can take from a bunch of other industries, but accept the fact that there isn't a direct corollary. It's not an immediate parallel to alcohol or to gaming or to whatever. And let's come up with an actual way to regulate it.
It's worth noting that alcohol was prohibited for a considerably shorter amount of time than where we are with cannabis, number one. Number two, what you just said is an argument for descheduling and decriminalization, in that the federal government arguably should have no involvement in regulating cannabis, and it should be left strictly to the states, because there are states that would say, we don't want cannabis here. We don't want cultivation, manufacturing, retail.
That's two different
You
things.
also
I
have
mean,
dry counties.
It's not necessarily, yes, it is an argument potentially for
Starting this back up
descheduling.
again.
No, it's an argument for descheduling, but I don't know that it's an argument for completely getting the federal government out. Like, I have no problem with the federal government coming up with its own policy, like its own version of the TTB, and saying this is how we're going to regulate cannabis in the United States, right? I have no issue for that. At the same time, and I could see the downsides to saying we're going to make it a state by state issue, right? Does that issue interstate commerce? I mean, we're getting way off topic for what we've been talking about with the idea, but like, I think to the larger point of, it's descheduling completely would be great. There's a lot of people that are like, why don't they just deschedule it altogether? Personally, having worked in the industry for a number of years and working for operators and seeing both sides of the coin, I don't see how you could deschedule and not have some kind of regulation for how to run the industry.
Yeah, I agree.
Like, it's not a bad, to me, it's not a bad thing. Regulation's not a bad thing. We've just been trained to say it's bad because cannabis is treated so poorly by regulators. But if you had actual equitable regulatory policy, whether it's at a state level or a federal level, that created an industry that allowed anybody to come in and wasn't so offensive and wasn't so hurtful and harmful to operators, and all of the bad things, why would that be why would that kind of regulation be bad? I'm not saying
I
it's gonna
think it's
happen.
just, yeah, it's like, it would be great. It just, unfortunately, like the regulators don't want to give the people that are hands-on with it.
Yeah,
the
I mean, I got a
power
pipe
to-
dream. It's
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
don't.
yeah, yeah. That would be great. It just, that's not
No.
unfortunately our reality, but I agree. I think it would be great to have a new agency created for this industry. I think that's a good idea. But then it goes back to
Not
how do we do
ATFC.
If only they'd listen to me.
it?
You got to run for office. Did anyway? We got another question. Wow. By the way, there's a Q&A portal in case you guys don't know. Hi, Kim. I don't think
How
it
do you
changes a
think the
damn
Safe
thing.
Banking Act will affect financial institutions that are banking cannabis already? I think a couple things will happen. Safe Banking Act may open up the credit card companies in the credit card industry.
Woohoo.
That's a big giant may. That will impact. So payment solutions is a potential. Also lending, I think, is where you could see the most immediate impact. We work with a lot of banks that are already lending in the industry.
Same.
And the costs associated with banking and
Yeah.
lending and so on and
Right.
so forth would be considerably less,
Right.
ideally.
And the banks have a lot of regulations that they have to follow that are obviously that are stricter than for a normal bank client. And so, they have to like check on that client more often and vet all of the books and everything. So it's like, once that's gone, then that's how we have lower.
It's a lot easier if you
lower
use green
fees.
check.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is if safe banking passes, do I see Bank of America and Chase jumping in? No.
But they'll bank you or
Well, I think
I still don't think they will.
I think it gets easier with them from like a personal standpoint. So one of the things that people I don't think realize is if you derive your income from a cannabis company, you actually struggle to get loans sometimes, mortgages, car notes, things of that nature, right? So I see if Safe Bank, yeah, I think then a person will be able to have more of their own personal services at a BOA or a Chase. But some of these banks also they have a directive to only take in so many cannabis companies, and once they have their metric, they're done. They don't take anymore.
It's a risk ratio factor.
Yeah.
a lot of that is predicated on the fact that cannabis is a Schedule I drug.
Mhm.
So to loop it back around, right? If we are to move to reschedule to Schedule III, there are a number of positives and intangibles that we really can't even identify at the moment.
Let's throw a poll out here and a poll to everyone watching. Put it in the comments what you think. What's ultimately the DEA going to do? Are they going to keep it Schedule I, move it to Schedule II, or move to Schedule III? What do you think? You think 3? What do you think, Todd?
I want it to stay where it is, but I think it's going to go to 3.
I actually think they're going to find a way to keep it at Schedule I.
That makes sense. Going back to the banking, going back to the banking thing, I don't think anything on the way that banks have to work with companies, the cannabis companies, changes. I just think they're going to be happier to do it, and they will offer more services to those companies, and potentially will get more banks. But I think they're going to have to go through the same hoops that they go through today.
Yeah, I mean, and you know this from the work you do. The reality is, if you called almost any one of us and said, "I'm operating in X state, I need a bank," we could find you. Like I could find you a bank in 10 minutes in any state.
Yeah,
Right. It's not a question of finding accounts. Like I love when people are like,
there's like 300 banks
Yeah.
across the country banking
I love when
accounts.
people are like, I can't get a bank to bank me and take my proceeds. And I'm thinking, no, you can. You just don't want to pay the fee.
Yeah,
Right. And banks aren't actually making money off of the fees. They're actually paying for their increased compliance. Banks are making money from the fact that you're putting 10 million, 50 million, $100 million a year of cash in their coffers, and they can then turn around and distribute.
I mean, so everybody outside of the board in the bank wants to offer the full suite of services because they want to lend to the industry because that's what they make their money on, not just holding the deposits.
I mean, I think, look, SAFE, if it passes, is, it's going to open up more than likely it would open up the exchanges in the US.
That would be,
It would make insurance much more easily obtainable. There are a whole bunch of ancillary issues around it, but is the world that we live in today such that there is no banking for cannabis and all these companies operate in cash basis? No.
Okay, what about this? If we don't have a descheduling event, do you think that safe banking will pass this time?
Well,
This
safer is being heard next week.
Yeah.
So there's a very real possibility that there could be movement on safer before the DEA even thinks about answering this.
So that all depends on whether or not the senators that are behind it don't mark it up anymore. Booker's already said he's going to market, he potentially will mark it up, and whether or not the House will go along with whatever Christmas trees they throw on there.
Yeah.
So, I mean, look, my take on it is, and I would love to be wrong. We've got a Democratic president, a Democratic Senate, a bill that's passed 7 times in the House, 9 times in the House, whatever it is. And they still haven't gotten it done yet. Like Schumer's got to get out of his own way. Booker's got to get out of his own way. If Safer does it, more power to him.
So you're saying there's a chance.
It's always chance.
Yeah.
Oh, we got another question. See, the more we BS, more questions we get.
So, so is this end up being a double-edged sword, allowing more industry, small business, due to the removal of 280E, but ultimately end up causing an increase in unemployment in the sector as big pharma is more involved?
And that's a loaded question.
And very much a possibility.
I'm
We have
happy
no
to-
idea.
I'll step
No
on that
clue.
landmine. I don't think it's going to lead to more unemployment. It might be a shift in employment into more corporate style companies, and your smaller independents will maybe dwindle. But I think that's a temporary thing. Like a lot of the smaller companies right now might go away because they're not well capitalized, they're not cash flow positive, or they're not profitable. But there's always going to be a chance for the small guy to come out of nowhere and grow their company, especially if they're passionate about what they do.
I'm going to say something that's probably going to get me in trouble, and I'm not trying to be offensive when I say this. I can take all the mics, right? For years now, I hear people in the industry saying everyone should have an opportunity to run a cannabis business if you want to, right? If you want to open up a dispensary, you should be able to. If you want to have your own little small grow, the reality is that's not the way business works. Not everybody gets to run the business you want to have. Not everybody's cut out to have the business that they think they should. That's not a cannabis thing. That's a business industry thing, right? That's the reality of it, right? Like, you can have the right to attempt to it, but that doesn't mean that you have the right to be successful at it.
That's very true.
Right. And so, like, the idea that all these businesses may fail because there's an increase in unemployment, right? That's like when people say, consolidation is bad for the industry. Is it though? Like, that's every industry. Like, that's every business.
There'll be a consolidation and then an expansion. It's like the Big Bang. Everything's going to go right back to it. And
But
then
that doesn't make cannabis any more unique than agriculture, farming, entertainment.
Right. I think for the first time, we have something that was an industry that existed, just albeit not legal. And that's where you obviously get the majority of the pushback from, is there have been people who have built cannabis businesses for years and years that did it legacy or whatever you want to call it. So they're like, well, I want to do it for real and not have to look over my shoulder anymore and be able to do that. And the unfortunate part is there are jobs for those people in the industry, but there may not always be an opportunity to run a business in the industry. So, I hope most of them get the opportunity. I'd love to see that. And I would love for the farmers to not go anywhere. But at the end of the day, this is America and capitalism reigns supreme. So, the free market will figure it out. I hope regulation doesn't push them out, but how many small batch whiskey distilleries do you know? Yeah, they're there. I don't know anyone who makes moonshine anymore. It's not the 20s.
It's funny. We were also talking about we were talking about like if safe passes or descheduling or anything.
Moonshine.
One of the other things that's like going to be huge is SBA loans.
That would be huge.
Right now, cannabis companies can't get small business administration loans,
And that's
which are
a huge
typically
barrier to
startup
entry.
business loans. That's a huge issue. So opening up SBA loans for a lot of these small operators,
Yeah.
would help get
If-
them to that.
If I want to open a pizza shop, I can go to the bank and get a loan to start my pizza shop. And I can know with my cash flow that, okay, I can pay that loan back. You can't do it in cannabis. You have to go to greencheck.com/marketplace. We do pre-revenue lending.
Greencheck.com.
Verified.
So any more questions? It's getting late. All right.
Join us at Koyo Taco for
So
CLAB.
this
if
isn't
you're
live.
available.
Well, there's a couple people on it live, but we're gonna put it out probably recording next week for the general public. The people who are members got to see it this week.
Great seeing you
So,
at
thank
Koyo
you.
Taco for CLAB.
Oh, we have one more. You're very welcome.
You're welcome.
So thank you to my panelists tonight. I know this is more of like a podcast type thing. Paula, great to have you back.
Thank you. Thank
Sparks
you.
Uncensored. Zach, always great to have you here.
Yo.
Third Thursday of every month, mostly at American Social, but check it out. Join CLAB.com. Red site was just recently redone. Check out the digital membership. Check us out. Elevate Your Grind. YouTube.com/Elevate Your Grind.
What else should they check out, Todd?
Ackerman.com, SparksConsulting.co, Canaccord Group.com,
And what?
greencheck.com. We'll see you guys next time. Stop recording.